The first time I realized something was wrong, I was driving back from town on a quiet Thursday afternoon. From the road, I could already see something unusual on my field. At first, I thought maybe a neighbor had parked a truck there temporarily, but as I got closer, my stomach dropped. There were cars everywhere, sedans, SUVs, pickup trucks, at least 20 vehicles scattered across the grass like it was some kind of public parking lot, and planted right at the edge of my property was a bright yellow sign. Event parking, $20. I pulled my truck over and stepped out slowly. For a moment, I just stared at the sign, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. My field sat next to a popular lake trail that had become busy over the past few years, but it was still private property. Always had been. No one had permission to park there. Yet somehow, people were treating it like a paid parking area. I walked closer and noticed something even stranger. Next to the yellow sign was a small folding table, and sitting behind that table was a teenager wearing a reflective vest. He had a cash box in front of him. When he saw me approaching, he gave a friendly wave. "Parking's $20, he said. I blinked. "Excuse me?" "For the lake trail," he explained. "Cash or card?" I looked out across my own field again. More cars were arriving. Drivers were pulling in, handing money to the kid, and parking wherever they wanted. The grass that had taken months to grow was already getting flattened under tires. "Who told you to do this?" I asked. The teenager pointed up the road. "The HOA." That answer didn't surprise me nearly as much as it should have. About 6 months earlier, a new development had opened nearby. 70 houses, a clubhouse, and of course, an HOA. They had already caused a few small headaches in the area, complaints about farm equipment on the road, letters about noise from tractors during harvest season. But turning my field into a paid parking lot? That was new. "Which HOA member told you to set this up?" I asked. The kid shrugged. "Some lady named Karen." Of course. There always seemed to be a Karen involved in these situations. Apparently, the HOA board had decided to start charging visitors for parking near the lake trail. But instead of building their own lot, they had simply chosen the closest open field. Mine. I took a deep breath and tried to stay calm. "Listen," I said gently. "This is private property." The teenager looked confused. "But the HOA said it's fine." "They don't own this land." He glanced nervously at the cars. "Oh." Just then, another vehicle pulled up. A couple rolled down their window and handed the kid a $20 bill. He hesitated, then looked at me. "Should I take it?" I shook my head. "No." The driver frowned. "What's going on?" "This field isn't a parking lot," I explained. "You've been misinformed." Within minutes, a few other drivers had stepped out of their cars. People started asking questions. Some were annoyed, others just looked confused. But the biggest problem wasn't the crowd. It was the damage. My grass was getting torn up by the minute. If people kept parking there all weekend, the field would be ruined. I pulled out my phone and took pictures of everything. The sign, the cars, the table with the cash box. Evidence. Because something told me the HOA was about to claim they had permission, and I wanted proof that they didn't. An hour later, I drove down to the HOA office. Their clubhouse sat at the center of the neighborhood like a small resort. Manicured lawns, stone walkways, perfect landscaping. Inside the office, I found the HOA president sitting behind a large desk. Her name tag read Karen Whitmore. She looked up with a polite smile. "Can I help you?" "Yes," I said calmly. "I'm the owner of the field next to the lake trail." Her smile faded slightly. "Oh." I placed the photos on her desk. "These were taken about 30 minutes ago." She looked at them briefly. Cars parked across my grass. The yellow parking sign. The teenager collecting money. Karen leaned back in her chair. "Yes, that's part of our new parking program." I stared at her. "My field is not part of your parking program." She waved a hand dismissively. Well, it's unused land. Unused doesn't mean public. Our residents needed additional parking for visitors, and you decided to charge people to use my property? She sighed like I was the difficult one. It's just temporary. That was the moment I realized something important. Karen truly believed the HOA had authority over everything around them, even land they didn't own. So I said something very simple. You need to remove those signs immediately. She shook her head. We already hired attendants for the weekend. Then you should call them. Our event starts tomorrow morning. I crossed my arms. This is private property. Karen's expression hardened. Well, she said coldly, maybe you should have fenced it. I left the office shaking my head, because that sentence told me exactly how the HOA planned to handle this. They weren't going to stop, not unless someone forced them to. So I drove back to my field. By the time I arrived, more cars had arrived, and people were still paying to park. That's when I made a phone call, not to the HOA, to a towing company. Because if the HOA wanted to treat my field like a paid parking lot, then I was about to treat those cars like illegally parked vehicles on private property. And before the sun went down that evening, tow trucks were already on their way. By the time I returned to my field, the situation had gotten even worse. What had started with 20 cars was now closer to 40. Drivers kept arriving, handing money to the teenager at the folding table, and parking wherever they could find space. My grass was getting flattened in wide, muddy tracks. If it rained later that week, the entire field would turn into a disaster. But what the drivers didn't know was that help was already on the way. Not from the HOA, from the towing company. About 30 minutes later, the first tow truck appeared on the road. Then another, and another. 3 trucks in total. They rolled slowly up the gravel driveway and stopped near the edge of the field. The drivers stepped out and walked over to me. You the property owner? One of them asked. Yes. I handed them a printed copy of my property map and the photos I had taken earlier. This land is private, I explained. Those vehicles are parked here without permission. The driver nodded. That's all we need. Tow companies don't waste time. Within minutes, one of the drivers backed his truck up to a parked SUV near the center of the field. The metal lift slid under the front tires. Hydraulics whined. And suddenly, the SUV's front wheels were off the ground. That's when the shouting started. A man who had been hiking near the trail came running across the grass. Hey, that's my car! The tow driver barely looked up. Vehicles illegally parked on private property. What do you mean illegally parked? The man pointed angrily toward the road. I paid $20 to park here. The tow driver shrugged. You'll need to take that up with whoever took your money. Then he began securing the chains. Within seconds, the calm afternoon turned into chaos. People who had been relaxing by the lake started rushing back toward the field. Drivers were pointing, arguing, shouting. Some were pulling out their phones and recording the towing. The teenager at the table looked like he wanted to disappear. He closed the cash box and stepped away slowly. I think I should leave, he muttered. That's probably a good idea, I said. The first SUV rolled slowly toward the road on the back of the tow truck, and that's when Karen showed up. Her car pulled into the driveway fast enough to spray gravel behind it. She jumped out and marched straight toward the tow drivers. What is going on here? I crossed my arms. You remember the conversation we had earlier? Her eyes moved from me to the tow trucks, to the angry crowd of drivers. You called tow trucks? Yes. You can't tow these cars. They're on my land. They paid for parking. They paid the wrong person. Karen turned toward the tow truck driver. You need to put that vehicle back immediately. The driver didn't even slow down. Ma'am, we have authorization from the property owner. This is part of an HOA event. That's nice, the driver replied. But the HOA doesn't own the field. By now, several car owners had gathered around Karen. You charged us for parking. Now they're stealing our cars. Who's responsible for this? Karen's face turned bright red. She pointed toward me. He called the tow trucks! Every pair of eyes turned in my direction, but I stayed calm. Yes, I said clearly, because the HOA started charging people to park on land they don't own. The crowd fell silent for a moment. A few people looked back toward Karen. That's when the second tow truck hooked another vehicle. A red pickup truck this time. The owner ran over, waving his hands. Stop! Stop! But it was already too late. The truck's wheels lifted off the ground. Karen stepped forward angrily. You're creating a public disturbance. No, I replied. You did that when you started selling parking spaces. More arguments broke out across the field. Some drivers were demanding their money back. Others were yelling at the HOA volunteers who had helped set up the signs earlier. One woman held up her phone. I'm posting this online right now, another man shouted. This is a scam! Karen tried to shout over the noise. Everyone calm down! But nobody was listening. Eventually, someone called the sheriff's office. 2 deputies arrived about 20 minutes later. They stepped out of their patrol car and immediately took in the scene. Tow trucks, angry drivers, dozens of cars still parked across the grass. One of the deputies walked over to me first. You the property owner? Yes. Did you authorize the towing? Yes. He nodded. Then he turned toward Karen. Did the HOA give people permission to park here? She hesitated. Well, we organized an event. On land you don't own? Karen didn't answer, and that silence told the deputies everything they needed to know. The second deputy looked at the tow drivers. Keep doing your job, he said. Then he turned to the crowd. Anyone parked here without the owner's permission is subject to towing. Suddenly, the mood of the entire crowd changed. Drivers started sprinting toward their vehicles. Engines started turning over. People were trying to escape before their cars ended up on the back of a truck. Within minutes, the field turned into a mad scramble. Cars reversed. Drivers rushed toward the exit. Some nearly got stuck in the muddy tracks. But the damage had already been done. 2 vehicles had already been taken, and dozens of furious drivers were demanding answers, mostly from Karen. As the crowd slowly cleared out, Karen stood beside the road staring at the torn-up grass. Her entire parking operation had collapsed in less than 2 hours. Finally, she turned toward me. You're going to regret this. I shook my head. No. You are. Because the people leaving that field weren't just angry about the towing. They were angry about something else. The $20 they had paid the HOA. And judging by the looks on their faces, they were all about to demand their money back. And what Karen didn't realize yet was that the real trouble for the HOA was only just beginning. Because by the time the sun went down that evening, those videos of cars being towed from the paid parking lot were already spreading online, and the words HOA parking scam were starting to appear everywhere. By the time the last car left my field that evening, the grass looked like a battlefield. Deep tire tracks cut across the ground. Mud patches had replaced what used to be healthy green grass, and the bright yellow Event Parking 20 sign now leaned sideways in the dirt. The towing company had already hauled away 2 vehicles before the crowd scattered. Most drivers managed to escape before their cars were hooked, but they didn't leave quietly. As they drove away, nearly every single one of them had the same question. Where's our money? And unfortunately for Karen, the answer was sitting in a small metal cash box that the teenage parking attendant had taken straight back to the HOA office. That night, the situation exploded online. Several people who had been parked in my field had recorded the towing with their phones. One video showed a tow truck lifting a red pickup while the owner shouted in the background. Another video captured Karen arguing with the deputies. But the clip that spread the fastest was the one where someone zoomed in on the yellow sign. Event parking, $20. And the caption someone added underneath it read, HOA charging money for parking on land they don't even own. Within a few hours, the video had thousands of views. By the next morning, it had tens of thousands. Meanwhile, The HOA office was dealing with something much worse than bad publicity. They were dealing with refund demands. Drivers who had paid to park were calling nonstop. Some wanted their $20 back. Others wanted compensation for the towing fees, and a few of them were threatening legal action. One man claimed his car had been taken while he was hiking for only 20 minutes. Another said he had driven 2 hours to reach the lake trail. Now he had to pay over $200 to retrieve his car from the tow yard. Every one of those complaints ended up on Karen's desk. The next morning, around 10 a.m., there was a knock on my door. When I opened it, Karen was standing there again. But this time she didn't look angry. She looked exhausted. Her hair was messy. Dark circles sat under her eyes, and she held a thick folder under one arm. "We need to talk," she said quietly. We sat down on the porch facing the field. She stared at the damaged grass for a long moment before speaking. "This situation has gotten complicated." I raised an eyebrow. "That's one way to describe it." She opened the folder and placed several papers on the table. "These are refund requests." Then she placed down a few more. "And these are towing complaints." Finally, she slid one last document toward me. "And this one is from a lawyer." I picked up the paper and glanced at it. One of the drivers whose car had been towed was demanding reimbursement for the towing fees, plus additional damages. He claimed the HOA had misrepresented the parking area as legal. Karen rubbed her forehead. "The board is furious." "With you?" I asked. "With everyone." Apparently the HOA had made nearly $1,200 in parking fees that afternoon, but the cost of refunds and towing complaints was already much higher, not to mention the damage to the HOA's reputation. Several residents had already started asking questions. Why had the board organized paid parking on land they didn't own? Why hadn't they checked property records first? And why had Karen ignored the warning I gave her earlier that day? Those were questions she didn't have good answers for. "Look," Karen said eventually, "we'd like to resolve this situation." I leaned back in my chair. "Go on." "The board is willing to issue refunds to everyone who paid." "That's a good start." "And we're removing the parking signs permanently." "That's also a good idea." She paused. "However, we'd like to avoid further legal problems." I understood what she was asking. The HOA was hoping I wouldn't take the situation any further. Technically, I could have. They had charged money for using my property without permission. That alone could have caused serious legal trouble. But honestly, I didn't want a lawsuit. I just wanted my field left alone. "I'm not interested in suing the HOA," I said. Karen looked relieved. "But the field needs repairs." She glanced out across the grass again. The tire tracks were impossible to ignore. "What would that cost?" she asked. "About $4,000. Her eyes widened slightly. "For grass?" "For damaged soil, reseeding, and equipment time." After a moment, she nodded. "I'll bring that to the board." 3 days later, the HOA sent me a check. $4,000 to repair the field. They also posted an announcement to residents explaining that the parking program had been canceled. The signs were removed, the table disappeared, and the idea of charging for parking on my land quietly died. Over the next few weeks, the grass slowly recovered. With a little reseeding and some rain, most of the damage faded, but the story didn't disappear completely, because the video of the towing incident kept circulating online. Every once in a while, someone would send me the link again, and the comments were always the same. People couldn't believe an HOA had tried to run a parking business on someone else's property. A few months later, I ran into one of the HOA residents at the local hardware store. We chatted for a few minutes. Then he laughed and said something that stuck with me. "You know," he said, "that parking stunt actually ended Karen's time as HOA president." Apparently, the board had voted to replace her after the incident. Too many residents were embarrassed by the whole situation. And honestly, that outcome didn't surprise me, because HOAs sometimes forget something very important. They can write rules, they can organize events, they can manage their own neighborhoods, but they cannot take control of land that doesn't belong to them. That lesson cost the HOA a few $1,000s, and Karen her position as president. But it could have been much worse. All things considered, they got off pretty lucky. Subscribe my YouTube channel for more HOA interesting videos.